The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, historian Eric Foner on the ongoing battle over who is considered equal under the law. Peniel Joseph on why the strength of the Democratic Party lies in its diversity. Plus, Bill Press talks about justice in the Trump administration with Ed Chung, Vice President for Criminal Justice Reform at the Center for American Progress. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Eric Foner is one of this country's most prominent historians. His newest book tells how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments altered the course of history and changed what it means to be an American. And we say hello to Eric Foner, DeWitt Clinton Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University. He specializes in the Civil War and Reconstruction, slavery, and 19th century America. His book, The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery, won the Pulitzer, Bancroft, and Lincoln Prizes for 2011. His latest book is The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution. Eric Foner, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Very nice to talk to you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. This book is about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, all passed after the Civil War. And the way you describe it, this was much more than amending an existing document. As your title states, this was a remaking. In what ways were these new amendments transformational to our American ideals?
Right. Well, the title, The Second Founding, suggests that these three amendments should be considered as important as the original founding through the Constitutional Convention and the original Constitution, because they completely transformed the relationship between individual Americans and the federal government, and they, for the first time, established a set of rights for all Americans that no state could interfere with. So the 13th Amendment irrevocably abolishes the institution of slavery. Of course, some people feel this is the inevitable outcome of the Civil War, but actually it was quite a fight to get it ratified. But, you know, the original Constitution protected slavery in certain respects. For example, saying that fugitives who ran away had to be returned. Now, nobody, no state, no institution, nobody can own a slave in the United States. That's a fundamental shift in the whole nature of our society to begin with, because the founders had made their peace with slavery. Secondly, the 14th Amendment, the longest and most important amendment since the Bill of Rights, first of all, creates a definition of citizenship. Anybody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, with the exception at that point of Native Americans, who were still considered citizens of their tribal nations. But, before the Civil War, the Supreme Court said black people couldn't be citizens. Citizenship was only for whites. Dred Scott decision, 1857. Now you get a definition of birthright. Anybody born, it doesn't matter your race, your religion, your ethnicity, your national origin, a uniform definition of citizenship. And then it goes on to say, well, those citizens have to enjoy the equal protection of the law. Again, that's a fundamental shift. There was no state in the Union before the Civil War that accorded full legal equality to black people. Massachusetts came pretty close, but most states had serious legal restrictions on the rights of free African Americans, not to mention slaves. That's true North and South. Now you get this idea that equality is part of not only citizenship, actually that applies to all persons, which means immigrants, aliens, people not naturalized are also entitled to basic equality. And then the 15th Amendment tries to guarantee the right to vote for all black men in the country. Again, a fundamental shift. Before the Civil War, hardly any black men could vote, only in a few New England states where there were very few of them. So this really changes the whole nature of the body politic. So you take those together, and they create a completely new principle of equality and a completely new relationship between the federal government, which now is overseeing the states to make sure that they don't violate citizens' rights, the federal government and individuals in the United States.
You know, and it's obviously a very painful part of our history that it took so long to get to this moment of remaking. Part of this is because equality and citizenship were not clearly defined in our founding documents. Do you look at that as perhaps intentional on the part of the framers, or does it have more to do with their inability to imagine an end to slavery?
I think the main thing with the framers was even though they wanted to strengthen the federal government, that's why you had a constitutional convention in the first place, still they had a state-centered view of politics. Citizenship was defined by each state. You're quite right that the original Constitution doesn't say who is a citizen. It doesn't say what the rights of citizens are. The only thing it says is that states have to recognize the so-called comity clause, that states can't discriminate against citizens of other states. So if you move from New York to Ohio, you have to enjoy the same rights as other people in Ohio. They can't say, hey, wait a minute, people from New York don't have the same rights here as we do. Although states did that for blacks, there was plenty of states that said no black can even come and live in this state. Another sign of how racial distinction was built into the legal system before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
As this nation evolves, there are moments when the law is ahead of public opinion, and times when the law is responding to public opinion. Which was leading the way with regards to these new amendments?
I think there's a kind of symbiotic relationship. Of course, these could not have been ratified without the Civil War. That's number one. It's not just public opinion, it's the titanic conflict over, first of all, the Union and then the fate of slavery. And then the Civil War also brings 200,000 black men into the Union Army and Navy. So that helps to create a public opinion which sees them as worthy of American citizenship for the first time. So it's a unique moment in American history, and it's a moment in which this great crisis has propelled public opinion forward, way beyond where people could have imagined before the Civil War. So it's this combination. You know, historians always debate, is it is contingency that is just the kind of unpredictable flow of events, or is it the structure of the society that explains public opinion? And, you know, it's some kind of combination of both.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Eric Foner, DeWitt Clinton Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University. His latest book, The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution. Eric, politics, often the art of compromise. What were the biggest compromises that had to be hammered out to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments?
Right. Particularly the 14th and 15th it contained compromises which in some way weakened them looking down the road. I think the 13th, the abolition of slavery, that's not a compromise. That's a fundamental change in the nature of the society. But the 14th, for example, the radical Republicans wanted to immediately give African-American men the right to vote throughout the nation, but mostly in the South, really, where almost all of them, 90% of blacks, lived in the South at that time. But other Republicans said, you know, blacks don't really enjoy the right to vote almost anywhere at this point, North or South, and I'm not sure we can get this ratified if we just give black men the right to vote. So instead of doing that, they put in a convoluted clause, Section 2, basically saying, well, it's up to the states who votes, but if they deny any group of men the right to vote, women don't count in this, then they're going to lose some of their representation in Congress. So, for example, Alabama had about 50% black population. If they don't give black men the right to vote, they're going to lose half their congressmen. By the way, that has never been enforced, even when, in the early 20th century, the southern states did take the right to vote away from African Americans. Their loss of representation was never enforced. And indeed, we should look at that today. As you well know, there are plenty of states today who are denying thousands of people, tens of thousands, the right to vote, the culling of voter rolls, the use of, ID laws and other voter suppression. Some of these states might be susceptible to losing a member of Congress by denying so many people the right to vote. But as I say, that section has never been enforced. But at the time, it was a compromise between the radical view of universal male suffrage and the fear that that would not get approved. Now, a few years later, they do put black suffrage into the Constitution in the 15th Amendment, which shows you the flow of events, the radical flow of events. But even the 15th is a compromise. It says no state can deny any citizen the right to vote because of race. It doesn't rule out many other ways of denying you the right to vote, such as literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all sorts of ways that eventually southern states would use to take away the right to vote without mentioning race. If you just pass a law and say, hey, black people can't vote, that's obviously a violation of the 15th Amendment. But what if you pass a law, as they did, saying, you've got to understand the state constitution to vote? Nothing about race. It applies to everybody. But in fact, the registrars will say, hey, these black guys don't understand the state constitution and they can't vote. Whereas any white guy who turns up, they'll say, oh, yeah, he's real smart. So the end result of that is to eliminate black voting without specifically mentioning race. And that's a kind of loophole that flows out of the compromise that made the 15th Amendment possible in the first place.
And as you point out, America is still battling over these ideas. Donald Trump has raised the idea of denying birthright citizenship. Felons are fighting for the right to vote, although winning in many states. Voter ID laws, which you mentioned, remain a battlefield. To what extent do you hear echoes of the same divisions that existed when these amendments were passed? I mean, have we regressed?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the reasons I find this Reconstruction era after the Civil War so fascinating, because those are issues that were fought out then that are still on our agenda today, as you mentioned. Who should be a citizen? Who should have the right to vote? Another one, terrorism. That was an era of homegrown American terrorism, the Ku Klux Klan and groups like that, which were using outright violence, assassination, arson to try to restore white supremacy in the South during Reconstruction. How does the government deal with terrorism? That's something on our agenda today, but it comes right out of the Reconstruction era. So, you can't understand America today without knowing something about that period 150 years ago.
Well, and this moment also redefined the balance of powers in terms of the states and the federal government. How disruptive was this?
Well, of course, it went against a long tradition of state power, states' rights. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, begins with the phrase, First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, et cetera, et cetera. And the liberties in the Bill of Rights, which is so essential to us, are protected against interference by the federal government. They did not apply to the states before the Civil War. Try to give a speech against slavery in South Carolina. You couldn't. It was against the law. Didn't that violate the First Amendment? No. The First Amendment's about the federal government. Now, one of the purposes of these amendments is to apply those restrictions to the states. Now, the states cannot deny you your basic privileges as citizens, and the federal government now is empowered to oversee the states and to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So that's a basic change in the nature of our federal system, empowering the national government and limiting the traditional powers of the states, and that led to a lot of opposition. No Democrat in Congress voted for any of these amendments. Certainly not the 14th and 15th. I think a couple did for the 13th. But certainly the 14th and 15th, the Democrats, North and South, said this is a violation of the traditional rights of the states, and in a certain way it was. It shifted the balance of power fundamentally toward the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the passing of these amendments was hardly the end of the story, and the struggle lasts to this day over how these amendments are enforced. Here, the Supreme Court has played a central role, often undermining the ideals expressed in these amendments. How are we to understand the intent of the Supreme Court over time with regard to these core ideas of citizenship and equality?
Well, in the first generation or so after Reconstruction, the Supreme Court slowly whittled away at these amendments. They defined these principles of equality, of citizenship, more and more narrowly, and they basically threw up their hands by the end and said, look, if the southern states, as they're putting the so-called Jim Crow system into effect, are going to take away the rights of black Americans, there's nothing much we can do about it. When Alabama basically denied the right to vote to every black person in the state, in the Supreme Court, and Giles v. Harris said, we can't do anything about that, folks. And what they did was use the 14th Amendment mostly to protect the rights of corporations, and to say that the guarantee of due process in the 14th Amendment applied also to these corporations, and therefore states couldn't regulate railroad rates or labor conditions or things like that. It took a long, long time until the Warren Court in the 1950s and 60s for the Supreme Court to reinvigorate these amendments when it came to issues related to race. But they also did use it in other ways, because remember, the language of the 14th Amendment is not racial. It applies to everybody, all persons, all citizens. So you began to get 14th Amendment decisions expanding, famous cases, one man, one vote. That Baker v. Card, that's a 14th Amendment decision. The right to privacy, Griswold, Roe v. Wade, those are 14th Amendment decisions. They are telling the states they can't abrogate basic constitutional rights. Gay marriage, which just a few years ago, 14th Amendment decision. In other words, the irony is the court has reinvigorated the 14th Amendment when it comes to just general principles in the society, but when it comes to race, which is what was on the mind of the people in the 1860s, it's very narrow. It's still very constrained. The court today, so one of the lessons of this is in the hands of a conservative Supreme Court, our basic liberties are not secure. That's a sad commentary, but it's a truth, and given the Supreme Court we have today, we need to be cognizant of it.
And here we are, well into the 21st century, still having some conversations that they were having, 100, 150 years ago. It's a little, it's a little scary. I feel like we're sort of on a slippery slope.
It's a warning. It's a warning that has been known way back into the 18th century. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We cannot take our rights for granted. Rights can be gained and rights can be taken away. We cannot simply assume that the Supreme Court or other courts are going to, take an expansionary view of these amendments and try to really use them to promote the basic principle of equality. It requires vigilance to protect the freedoms that we have.
Okay. Eric Foner, DeWitt Clinton Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University. His latest book, The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution. Professor, we appreciate your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back again with us sometime soon.
Certainly. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk with you as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, Peniel Joseph on how Democrats can win in 2020. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Generations of working-class shrimpers, oysters, and other fishing families on the sparkling bays along the Texas coastline of the Gulf of Mexico have long shared the waterways with alligators and snakes that also call this place home. But in the 1980s, a strange and invasive new critter entered Lavaca Bay, and it's been devouring whole species of seafood along with the livelihoods of local Gulf communities. This was not some monster from the deep, but a massive 45,000-acre factory owned by Formosa Plastics Corporation, founded by the richest man in Taiwan. Formosa is not here for seafood. It's the world's second-largest fabricator of polyvinyl chloride, the tiny, highly toxic pebbles and powders used to make the gabillions of plastic bags, pipes, bottles, etc. For decades, Formosa has cavalierly been dumping trillions of these poisonous pebbles and tons of the polyvinyl powders into its wastewater, which end up in Lavaca Bay. That poisonous content then spreads to other bays and into the shrimp, oysters, fish, and other creatures living there, resulting in species vanishing from these waters. Wait, isn't this against the law? Of course, but petrochemical behemoths like Formosa have corrupted the law, turning Texas lawmakers and environmental regulators into their puppets. But when leaders won't lead, the people must, and that's exactly what's happening in this case. A defiant, determined shrimper and a scrappy environmental coalition have combined to win the largest citizen environmental lawsuit in U.S. history, forcing Formosa to stop its gross contamination. This is Jim Hightower saying, for information on the details and impact of this remarkable people's victory, go to Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid at trla.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Peniel Joseph is a leading public scholar on race and democracy in America. Looking ahead to 2020, he says Democrats are ready for a more progressive party, but can only win if that includes a commitment to black voters and their interests. And we say hello to Peniel E. Joseph, Professor of Public Affairs and the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. He's also the founding director of the LBJ School's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, and the author of numerous books, including the forthcoming Sword and Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Jr. Peniel Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to speak with you. One of the central themes of this election season for the Democratic candidates is whether to stay in the moderate lane or take a decided turn to the left. Do you believe that Democratic voters are ready for a more progressive party?
Absolutely. We saw this in the 2018 midterms. We had the highest midterm turnout nationally since 1970, and many candidates who were some of the leading voices, both in terms of congressional races, but local and statewide races, governorships, senators, but also statewide for district attorneys, and other electoral slots, really had very progressive opinions about health care, about criminal justice reform, about a living wage, about racial justice. So when we think about the party itself, the voters are definitely ready for a progressive party.
Well, and here's something that's interesting. There is a tension within the Democratic Party politics. Is the idea that a commitment to African-American voters and racial justice would somehow come at the expense of support from the white working class. What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, my take is that the white working class has stopped, in large part, voting for the Democratic Party for decades. So one of the things that's happened, sometimes we've called them Reagan Democrats, but really as early as 1968, when we think about Nixon, Humphrey, and Wallace, millions of white working class voters who had voted for Lyndon Johnson in 1964 voted for George Wallace in 1968. By 1972, they voted for Richard Nixon, and they really continued to be Republicans at the national level over the subsequent decades. At the statewide level, it took time for realignment. So for a place like Texas in the 1970s or 80s, there were still Texas Democrats who were winning elections, including Ann Richards, sort of the last Texas Democratic governor of the state of Texas. But eventually, those white working class voters found their way into the Republican Party at the municipal, at the state, and at the federal level. So one of the interesting aspects of the Democratic Party after the civil rights period, a heyday of the civil rights period, is that Democratic candidates win with a plurality of the white vote, especially with a plurality of white male votes. So Democratic candidates get anywhere from maybe 39 to 43% of white votes. And so in a lot of ways, you think about even the Obama coalition at its high point in 2008, President Barack Obama is still the only candidate to come close to 70 million popular votes in 2008. And in 2012, he got the second largest popular vote total in American history. He got 43% of the white vote in 2008 and 39% of the white vote in 2012. So in a lot of ways, the post-2016 election analysis was really off in a few ways. One, it conflates the working class as white and male and heterosexual, as if there are no people of color, no gay people or trans people, and no women who are part of the working class in the United States. And two, it also makes Democratic politicians focus in on probably the non-stickiest voter in the electorate for Democratic candidates. So the stickiest voter is black women by far. The non-stickiest is straight white men, especially straight white men who would identify as working class. They don't vote for the Democratic Party because they don't necessarily believe in what the Democratic Party is articulating, right? So the idea that somehow we're turning off the white working class is nonsensical. The only way you're going to win is with a plurality of white voters, and Obama showed us this, 43 and 39%, and robust black and Latinx and other turnout, right? Even to the point where when we think about the 2012 election, that was the first time in American history that black voter participation percentage-wise outstripped white, 66 to 64%. So between 2008 and 2012, there was about 2 million more African Americans who voted in the presidential election and about 1.7 million less white voters between 2008 and 2012. The largest uptick was in black women, right? So that's the voters who Democrats have to focus on if they're going to win the White House and just win national and local elections in the future.
Nobody's ever breaking down the numbers in that regard. And it puts a whole nother, gives it a whole nother look. It kind of opens your eyes to, have we just been playing the stereotypes within party lines for all of these years? And it kind of sounds like we have been.
We have been, especially since finally, the demographics that people like Bobby Kennedy in 1968, before his assassination, that people like George McGovern in 1972, that even a Walter Mondale tried to galvanize in 1984, and certainly Jesse Jackson, this idea of a rainbow coalition has finally come to pass. And you saw it with not just Obama in 08 and 12, you saw it in 2018 and the record number of women who were candidates who won. You think about Ayanna Pressley, you think about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you think about all this different infusion of energy. It's because of that idea of a rainbow coalition where, yes, whites are a healthy part of that coalition. But as we saw with Donald Trump's, at least his electoral victory, he didn't win the popular vote. Hillary Clinton received the third largest popular vote in American history, but lost the election because the founders instituted something called an electoral college, which means that we have indirect democracy and not direct democracy for presidential elections. When we think about, what occurred there, it's occurring because of all these people of color, and Trump won every single white demographic. He won white men, he won white women, he won rich white men and rich white women. He won upper middle class white men and upper middle class white women. He won white middle class women and white middle class men. He won white working class men and white working class women. And it doesn't seem like those numbers are ever going to go down. He's got real sticky support there. So Trump absolutely is the white president and the white presidential candidate. And what the Democratic Party has to do is realize that its strength comes from its racial and ethnic and gender and otherwise diversity.
Look around the rest of the country, right? I mean, this is what we're made up of. It's not, we're not the white society. There's a long-held perspective that Democrats have taken African Americans for granted. Do you believe that the Democratic Party is shifting in the importance it places on African American voters?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that shift is occurring. I think it's occurring too slowly. And I think we're seeing, basically every major presidential candidate, but even when we think about the level of governors and Senate candidates and congressional staff and sort of the supply chain of our U.S. politics, start to take that more into account. It's still not enough. I mean, part of taking black voters into account is the makeup of your staff, the makeup of your consulting, the makeup of the supply chain that is connected to politics. And even when we think about the presidential candidates, it's not a diverse enough field because it's very hard for African American elected officials or would-be elected officials to get big donors, to get political action committees, to get the kind of mentoring and resources you need to become a viable candidate and be part of a viable organization within the Democratic Party. So I do think that the shift is taking place, and you're seeing candidates aware of the African American vote and especially black women and how important they are, but it's not happening. It's not happening quick enough.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Peniel Joseph, professor of public affairs and the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, author of numerous books, including the forthcoming Sword and Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Peniel, when Democrats lose, it's not unusual to hear black voters blamed for not turning out to vote. You touched on this a few moments ago. What's wrong with that analysis?
Well, I think that analysis is a very, very demonizing and dehumanizing turn because, one, we have a long history of voter suppression and voter repression in the United States, and certainly after the 2013 Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision, that voter suppression continues, including in states like Texas. Two, you can't ask African Americans to come out to vote when you are not articulating policies that would really be beneficial for them. And we're thinking about everything from a living wage. We're thinking about policies that promote racial integration instead of segregation, public school integration instead of segregation, employment, decent homes and communities, anti-racism in the criminal justice system and an end to mass incarceration, an end to domestic violence, an end to lack of child care and elder care, especially when we think about Black women and Latinx women. They're going to be some of the biggest caretakers in communities all across the country. And we have the data for that. Women are the stickiest caretakers of everyone. Women take care of children. They take care of people who are mentally ill. They take care of people who are non-able-bodied. Women take care of people who are HIV positive, people who have been injured in workplace accidents. Women take care of communities. And so to not have policies that not only are pro-women, but really pro-Black and Latinx women, because they are disproportionately the heads of households living right below the poverty line and right above the poverty line. So when we think about who are the workers in the country, they're really women of color. They are disproportionately the home health care aides, and we have tens of millions of people who are retiring in the baby boomer generation, the people who are going to be helping your parents and my parents, and helping them at night and giving them their medicine and getting in and out of the shower and cleaning up bedpans. These are women, and in large part, they're Black women and Latinx women. So if you don't have policies that say, hey, we are trying to help this constituency that is our stickiest voter, that has real concerns, then you can't blame them for not coming out at the polls. And you connect that to the fact that some who really want to come to the polls are experiencing voter repression and voter suppression. And we've seen this in virtually every single state in the country in the aftermath of the Shelby Holder decision, where states like Texas and states like Florida and others have instituted voter ID laws that now no longer have to go through federal pre-clearance. And that means they are targeting poor people, Black people, and people of color and people who are marginalized to make sure they do not vote. And we've seen this in Georgia in the Stacey Abrams run. So it's really reprehensible that the party, instead of trying to become the party that is an anti-racist party and a party that's anti-voting suppression, at times, and we saw this after the 2016 election, you blame Black voters for not coming to the poll. One, you weren't talking about their interest, and two, there is voter repression and voter suppression that is actually preventing them from exercising their citizenship rights and going to the polls.
Yeah, and I would say the latter is probably, not only is that more damaging because you're basically excluding a huge part of our population, but what's the incentive? Why would I, and not only that, they actually are voting, and to put the blame elsewhere is it's ridiculous to me.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Black women were decisive to Doug Jones winning the special Senate election seat a couple of years ago. He's going to be up in 2020, and Black women turned out for him at 97% in the state of Alabama when he won that special Senate election, and we had a Democrat in Alabama for the first time in decades. So no, I mean it's preposterous. This is the stickiest voter. It's Black women. They're the ones who are going to organize for you. They're going to be leading the get out the vote effort for you. They're going to be scouring senior citizens' homes and churches and all kinds of community spots for the Democratic Party. Yet when you think about Black women, how many of them are elected officials? How many of them are governors? None. How many of them are senators? One. How many of them are on Senate and congressional staff and part of the supply chain of U.S. politics? And that's what we're seeing. That's the disparity in terms of democracy and who's voting and sort of really the stickiest constituent of the Democratic Party, and what rewards does that constituency get, if ever.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned some things that Black voters would want to hear from a presidential candidate. And we do see the Democratic candidates making appeals to Black voters. But are they saying the right things?
Well, yeah, I think it really depends. I mean, there's been candidates who talk about everything from reparations to health care. And I think what, Black people want to hear about is policies that do a few things. One, end barriers to full and free citizenship. So when we think about these barriers, we're thinking about everything from racism in the criminal justice system and everything from being arrested, probation, parole, barriers from getting access to social welfare. And we think about the Clinton crime bill and welfare reform that prevents folks who've had marijuana violations, from ever living in public housing again, getting access to Section 8. It separates families. We're thinking about barriers to employment and check the box for people who are connected to the criminal justice system. So there's those barriers. There's also barriers of voting, like we just said, which is major. But then there's also barriers of just, lack of access to employment, educational barriers. African Americans disproportionately go and attend segregated schools that are also failing schools. Live in segregated neighborhoods, live in neighborhoods where there's environmental catastrophe. It's not just Flint, Michigan, neighborhoods where there is lead poisoning, where there's asbestos, where they're living next to toxic dump zones. That is the Black experience too often for the 42 million African Americans in the United States. So you want somebody who's going to be talking about both ending those barriers, but then talking about positive aspects of citizenship. And what are those positive aspects? Well, it's the American dream that everybody wants. You want a safe neighborhood for yourself and your kids and your parents when you think about multi-generational. You want good food, and we think about food justice, something that Michelle Obama tried to do. You want your kids eating organic fruits and vegetables and living healthy lives. You want great schools, and I think great schools are schools that are racially integrated, that reflect the diversity of the country and communities. You want good jobs. You want the entire American dream. So candidates have to talk about that, and some have tried, but I think too often we get into this sort of colorblind racism where we say we're not talking about race, and to even see race makes someone a racist. And really, it's quite the opposite. When you just try to make a claim that there is no difference between, in terms of disparate impact, in terms of Black, white, Latinx, Asian, others, and try to say that we're all getting our equal and fair share, when we know this is not true. We have the data. The way in which we connect with racism in the 21st century is outcomes. We can see the outcomes in terms of racial segregation, the criminal justice system, unemployment, who the financial meltdown in 2008 hit the hardest. So we know that there's inequality, not just wealth inequality, but racial inequality in the United States. So you need a presidential candidate who's going to really talk about that, both ending the negative barriers of citizenship, but talking about the positive aspects of citizenship that everybody wants, which is that health care and those safe and strong communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, and sadly, no matter what Democrats do in this election, we can count on Donald Trump to continue his appeal to racial division. Now, absolutely, you wrote that the midterm elections were about the soul of this nation. What did we learn from the midterms, and what's at stake in 2020?
Well, I think we learned from the midterms that there are competing visions of American democracy. And we've always had this, and in fact, we fought a civil war between 1861 and 1865 because of these competing visions. Over 700,000 Americans died in that civil war, a number that most Americans don't know and don't like to dwell upon. When we think about 2018, it showed us that, yes, there was Donald Trump's America, but there was another America, and we saw this in the House of Representatives, and Democrats took over the House. But we saw this in certain campaigns. We think about Andrew Gillum in Florida, who lost a close race by less than 40,000 votes to become the first Black governor of Florida. Stacey Abrams, who lost another close race with a lot of electoral shenanigans happening there in Georgia to become the first Black female governor of Georgia. And we saw this in Texas, where I live. Beto O'Rourke lost a very close race to Ted Cruz to become a Democratic senator here. And what you saw were tens of millions of people come out to the polls and said they embraced a multiracial, multicultural America. Really, they embraced Martin Luther King Jr.'s notion of a beloved community where our diversity, racial diversity, was really our strength and not something that was a weakness and not something that was going to divide us. So I think that 2020 is the same thing. I think we have competing notions of America. No matter what goes on with this president, we've seen that his poll numbers stay at around 40%. So there's a core group of Americans who do appreciate the racial division, the politics of white nationalism, and just the utter moral and political chaos that we're all enduring the past 3 years. But then there's another group of Americans and they're almost roughly co-equivalent when we think about the numbers, who really think about, a whole different notion of American democracy and the American dream, one that's multicultural, one that's multiracial, one where there's a moral and ethical center and character of the United States, and the United States of America is liberty's surest guardian domestically and internationally. And they don't think those words are cynical. They really believe those words, right? And so that is what we face in the 2020 election. Those two competing visions, groups of Americans who really do believe that we have a moral and ethical and political vision to lead, and lead in the cause of human rights, and lead in the cause of sheltering those who are hungry and homeless and refugees, and that we are a nation of immigrants, and we are a nation where all things are possible. And another group who really believe that there are limits and constraints on American compassion and American democracy and American morality. And from that perspective, we have these two clashing wills, right? And we're going to see, which vision plays out. And again, there's a long history of this. We didn't just have Abraham Lincoln in the 19th century. We had John C. Calhoun and Andrew Johnson and others who thought slavery was terrific and really a part and parcel of what made the world and made America great. But then we did have Abraham Lincoln, and we had other presidents who had a different perspective. So we are still facing that 150 years after the end of the Civil War. We're still facing these competing visions of American democracy, this time with no apparent civil war happening. But when you think about the incivility and the rhetoric of hate and division that has been sowed, there is a violent undercurrent to the rhetoric that's happening both around the election, but also just in our politics in a way that's truly frightening, but that's also very historic. There's a historic context for this kind of rhetoric where people are calling each other un-American, where people are hurling accusations. And this goes beyond impeachment. This is about the idea of citizenship and what are the prerogatives of citizenship. Can we disagree with each other without name-calling, without ad hominem attacks, and without questioning the patriotism of those who we disagree with?
Let us hope that in 2020 we get back on the right track. Peniel Joseph, professor of public affairs at LBJ School of Public Affairs at University of Texas, Austin. The numerous books, including the forthcoming Sword and Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Be sure to check that out when it hits the shelves. Peniel, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Would love to have you back again soon to talk more about it.
Absolutely. It's a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks to Ed Chung, Vice President for Criminal Justice Reform at the Center for American Progress. He follows the Barr Justice Department and says loyalty to Trump is replacing the rule of law.
Department of Justice about to release, could be as early as today, the official report on the investigation done by their Inspector General into the beginnings of the FBI investigation, which Donald Trump has claimed was a witch hunt from the beginning and was triggered by anti-Trumpers, Trump haters within the FBI who did this because they didn't want him to become president. What do we know of what this report concludes on that charge?
Well, one of the things that the Inspector General does is that he allows people who have either been interviewed or who have provided information to go back and look at parts of the report for accuracy to make sure that things were quoted correctly, et cetera, et cetera. And those people who looked at it and had that opportunity came back, and there have been media reports on that. The top line is that the investigation and the warrants to the FISA warrants that started this, the expectation is that the Inspector General is going to say there was nothing wrong with that. There's enough evidence that, and they were properly submitted and so forth. And so that really will debunk the main and the strongest point that pro-Trump supporters have been putting out, that this was baseless, it was only political, and there was no evidence to come behind it.
All right, so that let me sum that up so that we don't bury the lead. Donald Trump says it was a witch hunt, politically inspired from the beginning by people at the FBI. He orders Bill Barr to launch an investigation into that show. Barr does it. The report comes back and says that's not true. Right. There was good basis for this investigation. The FBI might have made some mistakes along the way, which agencies always do, but that there was solid reason. It was not a witch hunt. It was not illegitimate. It was not partisan. Correct?
Right. And the only part
which
that I would...
is huge.
Absolutely. It is huge. The end result is huge. The only part that I just want to clarify a little bit here is the role of the Inspector General, and this is not the same investigation that Trump ordered Barr to commit. This was with Barr, with the Inspector General in its capacity that it was able to.
I got it. Was able
but the conclusion is absolutely
still,
right. Yes.
He says, now, what does Bill Barr think about this conclusion?
So the reports are that Bill Barr is going to have an opportunity, and had an opportunity to file objections to it, and they expect to file objections to that. And to your bigger point, there is another investigation that's going on top of this that was based on after Bill Barr's testimony, I believe in the Senate, where he said, "I believe spying was going on," which then compelled him to appoint the U.S. Attorney for Connecticut to launch a separate parallel investigation into any of this. And so the expectation is that he's going to come out and file objections to many parts of this, probably including to that main conclusion.
Well, so let's talk about that. Is a criminal investigation, correct? Meaning that people in the FBI committed crimes?
Or people in or outside of the FBI, but yes, the investigation is people involved in the investigation of this. Yes. So
to what extent does this report by the Inspector General Michael Horowitz undermine the Durham report? If Horowitz concludes, hey, there are a lot of good reasons why the FBI should have been looking into this, doesn't that undermine Durham's investigation?
Absolutely. I think when you're looking at anything that's a parallel investigation like that, that's looking into exactly the same thing, that's undertaken by the same agency, the Department of Justice, right? Two different parts of it. And one comes out and concludes that nothing has been, like the top line, aside from some missteps that could have been made, there's sufficient report or sufficient basis to have investigated. That will undercut a lot of the criminal investigation underneath it. And there's already some reports that Durham, in some parts of the investigation, could not support the Republican talking points. Or I should say the Republican talking points, but the pro-Trump talking points, that this was all a sham and that there was nothing to rely on. So there was some reporting last week on that, and we expect that to happen. So if that's the case, really, this Inspector General's report, that top line, is a really huge thing that the American people should pay attention to debunk conspiracy theories.
All right. Now, back to the Inspector General's report. The basis for the investigation that he finds was at least twofold, as I understand it. One, George Papadopoulos over there in Europe, bragging about talking to Russian operatives and getting dirt on Hillary and connections with the campaign.
Right.
And then Carter Page, who had been under FBI suspicion for years, even before Donald Trump started running for president, right? And on that basis, they went to the FISA Court to get a warrant.
Right.
By the way, they went to the court to get a warrant, meaning they did it legally.
Legally. And that's such a good point to raise, because this wasn't just an offhand process. It is a robust process that has gone through different iterations because earlier versions of the FISA process had been under scrutiny as well. So now what you're looking at is going to an independent court that DOJ relies on for everything else when it comes to national security issues and to obtain warrants and to obtain to get an independent judicial finding for that. And one of the things that people should know about the FISA Court is that it's not a rubber stamp to whatever the Department of Justice wants to do. There is a lot of back and forth that happens between government lawyers and the FISA Court. And that, whether or not that happened here, it seemed like the regular processes, or at least what we're expecting the Inspector General to come and say, is that the regular processes were followed through, that an independent court approved those warrants and the surveillance techniques, and there was legitimate basis behind it.
Again, so the bottom line is not that the FBI agents didn't like candidate Donald Trump. It's that they saw evidence of collusion or with a foreign government by campaign operatives who were talking about it.
Yeah.
And they felt they had a duty to investigate it.
Absolutely. And this is one place where, going back to the criticism of FBI agents, it really rubs me the wrong way, because I had the pleasure of working with FBI agents on some very serious investigations. And, you get to know agents and you get to know them and their, who they are as a person. And, there are things that whichever side of the line that they lay on, that they come down on in terms of ideology or whatever, the FBI are very committed and dedicated agents. And so to then have people like the president, the attorney general, impugn their integrity based on nothing, Bill. That's the thing. You're basing this on a Maltese professor who's coming up with conspiracy theories to then get the Department of Justice process going, and then you have a criminal inquiry from the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut. That's the most confounding thing about this, where if it was based on legitimate reports of something going wrong and some illegality or whatever, that's a whole different story, and that should be something that's investigated. But these are things where the highest officials in our land are taking conspiracy theories at face value and giving them credence by then having the Department of Justice investigate that. And that's not what I'm saying that Michael Horowitz did, but that's what I'm saying that Bill Barr has done.
Bill Barr has done. Now, the Trump defenders in the Congress say that when the FBI went to the FISA Court, that they relied solely on the famous Steele dossier, which has never been, all parts of which have never been proven true. To what extent do we know that this Steele dossier
So the one thing
was the main cause of this?
Right. So the one thing that we do know about the Steele dossier is that, or at least the reporting of the Inspector General's report, is that there was one filing where the Steele dossier, parts of it, was not included in an application to the FISA Court. So we don't know yet exactly what impact that actually had. But the fact is that they had other information beyond that.
Back to Papadopoulos and Carter Page.
Exactly. Independent investigation into Trump campaign operatives, meaning not necessarily their role in the campaign, but they themselves doing things that in Europe and in other places, things that they shouldn't be doing, that were the basis of this investigation. So it wasn't just a third-hand, fourth-hand, second-hand information. It was investigation specifically into key players.
Now, one thing that I still do not understand, maybe you can help me with, is that the FBI had a parallel investigation going on at the same time into Hillary Clinton's emails, which we knew all about. They told us they were doing it. James Comey slammed Hillary Clinton, did nothing illegal, but was sloppy or whatever his words were.
Right.
Then he reopened the whole damn thing a week before the election. Meanwhile, this investigation into Donald Trump was going on, and they kept it totally secret.
Yeah.
Knowledge of that investigation certainly did not help Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Some people blame James Comey for her losing the election without going there. Yeah. Why did they blab about the Clinton investigation and yet keep the Trump investigation secret.
Yeah, I think this is one area where there is a non-ideological criticism of the way that James Comey handled that. And it was a...
either talk about them both or talk about neither one.
Right, exactly. And the sequencing of, obviously this has been litigated, but the sequencing mattered, and the amount of information at different points that were shared also mattered. The one difference here is that for the investigation into Carter Page and Papadopoulos and the Trump campaign, that involved a lot of national security issues that necessarily weren't at play as much in the Clinton email issue, which had been kind of out there for a long time in terms of the conspiracy theories around that as well. The problem then, is what you're pointing out. Why share that information publicly and then leave the American public with this kind of two-tiered, approach that it seemed like the FBI was taking?
So let's get to the Attorney General himself. We know that Donald Trump, frustrated in the days of Jeff Sessions, feeling he was not getting enough help from his Attorney General, famously said, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" He got him, didn't he?
He did. He did. And
what does that mean for people who don't know Roy Cohn?
Well, let me step back first and just talk about Sessions and Barr. I mean, the way that the American people should look at this is that these are two Trump appointees, right? So this is what Trump's vision of justice is. You can't look at anything else but who his Attorney General is, and also who his Supreme Court nominees and picks are, to look at what Trump's vision of justice is. And what he's looking for is somebody to serve him, not somebody to serve the interests of justice or serve the American people or to protect the Constitution and to defend the Constitution. He wants somebody who is looking to defend his personal interests and somebody who will, regardless of what the facts are and so forth, to be come to his aid. And I think that is the thing that you'll see not only with every single thing with the Mueller investigation with Ukraine, but the way that he conducts his policies, his administration, the way that he's just off the cuff and always thinking about himself personally.
Right. And Bill Barr fit that role, right?
He did.
And was willing to undertake that role. And so does he see the job of Attorney General as Trump's personal attorney?
Well, what we know is that he sees his job as somebody who defends the executive. And he looks at, it doesn't seem like he looks at this as the three co-equal branches of government as the Constitution and the framers laid out. He's looking at this as the executive branch has ultimate authority. And, that's going a little bit above, overboard, but to make the point, to emphasize the point that the criticisms, investigations, that the executive branch should have the leeway, as much leeway as possible. What's funny about that is that when you look at conservatives and Republicans who are talking about or defending Barr's approach and Trump's approach, this is the exact same thing that they would criticize Democrats about all the time, and not with valid criticism. So it's safe to say that Barr looks at the presidency and the executive branch and say he is a defender of that. His personal conduct during this administration shows what you're talking about, doing the bidding of Trump. And I think going back to the earlier conversation about saying that there was spying going on at the FBI, that line, when he said that in a congressional hearing, shows you how far he's gone, not only to defend the executive and to kind of lift the primacy of the executive, but to talk about to go to do what Trump himself wants, not necessarily his role as a
and his passion. People ask, why did Barr, who was semi-retired, even accept this job? And those who know him say he did because his passion is the unitary executive. Mm-hmm. That phrase,
right?
Which really, and this gives him an opportunity to advance that theory, right? Which really means the presence above the law.
Yeah, and it means that things like congressional subpoenas are not going to be followed through. Now, we've seen that in this impeachment inquiry by what the White House counsel does. There is a presumption that White House counsel is communicating with the Department of Justice, but you don't even have to go to that. You can go with other congressional subpoenas that the Oversight Committee has really looked at or issued to really have oversight of the Department of Justice. Their regular, constitutionally guaranteed right to do that. And this Department of Justice has been, the charitable way to say it is slow. The accurate way to say it is really just obstructionist about not honoring subpoenas from Congress. And that in itself shows exactly what we're talking about.
Right. So put this in context as someone who loves the law and respects our system of justice. What does it mean to have an attorney general or a Department of Justice that is seen as just an arm of the Oval Office and not this independent, ultimate authority of law enforcement in this country?
That's such a great question, Bill, because I think people, when you look at federal agencies and cabinet officials, some people automatically think that cabinet officials should just do the bidding of whatever the administration is. The Department of Justice is a unique agency. It is not upheld to just push out the policies
so
of
maybe the other agencies like transportation, right, or HHS or whatever, but not justice.
Right, and I'm not trying to diminish any other agency, but just the nature of the Department of Justice, because you have so many roles where you're talking about how the Department of Justice represents the United States in courts of law, or arguing before the Supreme Court, or being an arbiter and representing the people in court, in and of itself is a different role, and it's a unique and special role. So the Attorney General cannot just do what the president wants. The Attorney General, arguably more than any other cabinet official, has a separate duty, and hopefully they align in most situations, to uphold and defend the Constitution and to interpret interpret's not the right word, to make sure that the administration's policies are consistent with the Constitution, with the law. And that's important.
And people in the legal community are concerned.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
I mean, Republicans as well as Democrats.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always letters in this time going around and sign-on letters and so forth. But what's interesting is that the number of conservative, identify Republican people who have served Republican administrations, both administrations, have come out at not only how shocking the Trump administration is, but how shocking the Barr administration or the Barr Department of Justice has been in not upholding the kind of rule of law. And you hear these phrases all the time, Bill, about rule of law. And rule of law and making sure that we are governed in that way falls a lot on the Department of Justice to do, and Barr hasn't held up his end of the bargain on that.
Bill Press talking with Ed Chung, Vice President for Criminal Justice Reform at the Center for American Progress. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Eric Foner, Peniel Joseph, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.